They want to stop economic progress. Why was Raghuram Rajan, and why is he anti-manufacturing? These people want to stop the progress of the country, and they will do anything as much as they can. And when they're out of power, they're frustrated. When they're out of power, their sponsors are frustrated. So the best case scenario is to disrupt on the ground using protests, using a narrative, fake narratives, to say, for example, Muslims will be stripped of their citizenship, so go onto the streets. Sikhs are being targeted because the government wants to institute a free market reform. So push that narrative. Use identity, use policy, combine them together, and make it sound that the government is targeting you. And then bring people out onto the road, and then disrupt, cause financial damage, physical damage where possible, and then make the government walk back on things, and then stop the country's progress.
How dirty tricks were employed against the Modi government, because he was seen as adversarial to Western interests. At least he wasn't always in line with regards to Western, because, India's got her own interests. But $30 million is cited as the sum, that is given solely by the state, not by Soros, not by Omidyar. I mean, maybe indirectly through them, but this is through the State Department to Atlantic Council, to USAID, to Global Engagement Center, as well as to mercenary groups under the guise of digital resilience. And I'm kind of quoting ad verbatim exactly what was said, that, fact-checking digital resilience is essentially so that any nationalist or any person trying to explain their perspective the way Surya said does not gain share of mind. Essentially, that their hearts and minds are already captured by all these people.
Blatant disinformation being pushed by, for example, mainstream media outlets like Washington Post or New York Times, absolute lies. They attempt to gaslight the Indian reader, and not just the Indian reader. They want to portray an incorrect view of India to the Western audience, but they also want to tell Indians that their lived reality is wrong. So it's very nefarious, and it needs to be countered using literature that comes from India, with art, literature, films, documentaries, which show what the reality is. And even then, you cannot expect everyone to be convinced, but the internet is a powerful medium, and that's something which Indians must be able to harness.
नमस्ते, स्वागत है आपका इंडिया दिस वीक के नए एपिसोड में, और मैं हूं आपकी होस्ट आमना बेगम खालिद बेग के साथ.
Hi, this is Khalid Beg and welcome to yet another episode of India This Week. Today we're joined by Surya Kanegaonkar and Sagorika Sinha. Both are renowned geopolitical analysts. Surya writes for bylines for the Hindu as well as IBN, CNN IBN. Sagorika writes for IBN and Firstpost. Sagorika also runs a successful YouTube channel called An Unquestioning Mind. We'll share the link down in the first comment once this episode releases. As you can see from the title of the episode, we are going to discuss about the Western media bias towards India. And since we have two, renowned geopolitical analysts, they write a lot on civilizational issues as well. So it's the right topic to start with. Also, we'll be discussing Modi's US visit right now, which is currently happening. So first, Surya, to you, and then Sagorika, you can answer. Surya, we often see this term used very as a slur, as a loaded term towards, this term called Hindu Nationalist. And I remember I was doing a podcast once with Brown Pandits, and I said, if my friend is a Hindu and he's a nationalist, it's completely fine. I've grown up amongst Hindus. If I'm an Indian Muslim and I'm a nationalist, that's fine. And why else would you not be a nationalist towards your country? So that's as simple as I see it. But that's my lived reality, having been born and brought up here. But whether it's the New York Times, whether it's the Washington Post, or whether it's any average Western commentator, when he uses this term, suddenly feels like he's throwing it as a pejorative towards the natives, and it's a sin to be a nationalist, and worse if you're a Hindu nationalist. Why is that the case?
Thanks for this question. I think it's a very important one because first, when we look at nationalism in the Western context, it comes from a very dark place in many ways because it comes with the baggage of history from World War II, what German nationalism in many ways did to Europe, and perhaps even Japanese nationalism to parts of Asia. So when the Allies had won the Second World War, they came out of it with this agenda in some ways to kind of look at nationalism very critically whenever they see this idea kind of pop up anywhere in the world. Now, in the context of India, I mean, India was, struggled for independence and got independence, and it had to be a nationalist movement. If it wasn't a nationalist movement, it would still be a colony. But we have seen, for example, with there was a statue that was erected of Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose, and the Western commentariat was very critical because they said that he was a nationalist who took help of Hitler during World War II, and without looking at the context of where he operated and what he was actually trying to achieve, and for his own people, because the approach that many Western commentators take is that whatever India is doing must actually have a benefit or must be falling within the moral confines of what the West prescribes for India. So the second point that I want to make here is that most don't understand what Hinduism is and what Indian nationalism is. So in many ways, when Hinduism, first of all, the term that should not be used, it's a misnomer. There is no ism in Hinduism. In what is essentially a set of philosophies and a set of varied practices and traditions, which vary in many ways across the length and breadth of the country, but have its very strong roots in an approach to life, and which has lasted for more than 5,000 years. Now, this sort of culture and civilization is something that is the basis for Indian nationhood. By denying that reason to exist, the West can pretty much deny India's reason to have territorial sovereignty, or to even act as a sovereign state in many domains, because they say that you are just a union of states, that you don't really have a reason to exist. So I think that it's a very loaded sort of attack, because when you kind of denigrate Hindu nationalism, one is it could be from a place of ignorance. The second is it comes from a place of malice. And given the tendency over several decades to consistently use this term Hindu nationalism in the pejorative without trying to explore the history and the context of it, I think there is definitely malice at some level. And it's something we need to counter.
Sagorika, your thoughts on the whole loaded term that Hindu nationalists are these evil people out there to annihilate all the oppressed minorities?
Thanks, Khalid. I think Surya makes some very, very pertinent points, and I do want to take them forward, but to answer your question first about the loaded term, right? I've analyzed this, and I've written a thread that got a lot of notice internationally as well. I took the New York Times for reference, and I went back to the 1960s and the 1970s. And if you see Hindu nationalists now and feel that for Indians, we'd feel we wouldn't take it seriously, but for the Westerners, you would sense that fear. That is because it's not a decade old. It's not started after the BJP government. It is a continuation from the pre-independence English publications. It's been there throughout. You had the Britishers writing about the Hindu with the double O's, and it was always negative. Post-independence, you constantly had the Americans, who are essentially the descendants of the British colonial empire, they took this forward with keyword associations. For example, the thread I wrote about analyzed the usage of the word militant with Hindu. Every time a few authors mention the word Hindu, they always suffixed it with the word militant. Now, how you're going to feel about any population, whether it's religious or ethnic, if it is always suffixed with the word terrorist or militant? This is something that has been years in the making. So at that time, it was so pathetic that this author was actually writing about Hindus saving the Sikhs during the 1984 riots, and she was talking about both of the populations in a negative manner. She was upset about the Sikhs voting for a BJP candidate because the Hindus were helpful in saving the Sikhs, which, because of the Congress that instigated riots. And she actually talks about the saviors as militants. Instead of saying that Hindu saviors of the Sikhs were rewarded with a seat in the elections, she actually mentions Hindu militants who saved Sikhs. So, and it needs a little bit of critical thinking. I'm not sure if it is lacking in the West, or at least in the readers of such publications. But if you're reading about somebody saving somebody else, then you're not supposed to associate the word militant with them. That's not normal. Yet, this is the rhetoric that has gained popularity for decades. Now, once you've realized that that does not fly, let's use nationalism. Like Surya mentioned, nationalism has a connotation that is very negative for European and Western populations after World War II. So, when you use nationalist along with Hindu, and then you kind of change it to Hindutva, because the tva is not something that a Western population will understand. It's a Sanskrit suffix. So it just means the essence of, and it has political connotations, but it does not mean what they think it means, right? So now you just make it sound very exotic and nobody knows what to make of it, but it definitely is negative. So I think we've lost Khalid.
It's okay, we'll join in back.
Right. So this is just a continuation of the same rhetoric. So you have the Hindus who were dirty pagans who were converting these white women from Christianity to idol worshippers, to Hindu militants, to Hindutva nationalists. So you have these loaded terms. Find one Western publication that does not continuously say this. And this is not, by the way, we are analyzing English ones. I've analyzed French, German. Both these publications. I've also looked at Israeli and Japanese publications. None of them have positive things to say about India or Hindus. It's not now. It's for decades. They've never said Le Monde, which is the most popular French publication, writes terrible things. It would be termed Islamophobia if it were about the Muslims. It would be termed anti-Semitism if it were about the Jews. But nobody cares to make a political protectionism for Hindus, because we don't matter politically on the global level, at least as a religious population. Now, I just want to mention one thing that taking one thing that Surya mentioned about the union of states. Like he said, that Hinduism, it's kind of used to, without Hinduism as a base, the idea of nationhood would be lost, because that's what, whether you take the Marathas, whether you take even the Sikh Empire, everybody fought on that basis to preserve the nation from who they saw as invaders and outsiders, right? So Hinduism and Hindutva have a major role in preserving that, and that is why a lot of Western commentators, very big ones, professors and writers, they always talk about India not existing before 1947. Why? If you don't have an English label on it, it does not exist. What the apple was called, the pomme, it does not exist before it's named an apple. That's very silly, right? We don't have this for any other language, any other people except for Indians. We call ourselves Bharat, Bharatvarsha, Jambudvipa. We've had millennia of literature, but no, it did not exist before India. We were a disparate nation, group of states. Well, neither did the Greeks, neither did the UK. The UK was a disparate, group of countries that depended on the English East India Company, not the British, the English East India Company to come together. And there's a very good article on Firstpost by friend Deepak Srinivasan that also makes this point, that no modern state is was a modern state some decades ago. We all come to be. So the same thing, this is used to divide people. A union of states is actually in opposition to a federation of states, where states have more power than the nation itself. For us, it's the opposite. The Union of India has a lot more power than individual states. They don't have an identity separate from the union. That's what it means. It means the opposite of how people use it now. So,
okay. Very informative, Sagorika. I'm very surprised to learn that Israeli media is also not very favorable when it comes to...
Israeli and Japanese media don't write negatively, particularly. They're not very sensationalized. German and French, I just analyzed all of them, but German and French media certainly do. They're always negative.
So that's why I was very surprised. Israel as well?
No.
Okay.
No, yeah.
Okay. Taking forward this conversation, I would like to ask my second question. So, जो मेरा सवाल है वो बहुत सिंपल सा है कि जब भी हम यूरोपियन इंटेलेक्चुअल्स को पढ़ते हैं या उनके एकेडमिक वर्क को पढ़ते हैं, तो बहुत सिंपल सी बात समझ में आती है कि नेशनलिज्म को वो बहुत निगेटिव कॉनोटेशन में देखते हैं, बिकॉज उनकी एक हिस्ट्री रही है. इनफैक्ट पूरा का पूरा जो नाजी आइडियोलॉजी है वो सोशलिस्ट नेशनलिज्म का रहा है. एंड जब वो नेशनलिज्म की बात करते हैं तो वो विस्तारवाद की बात होती है, जहाँ पे वो अपने दे फील कि दे आर सुपीरियर एंड दे हैव अ राइट टू रूल अदर कंट्रीज. बट द सेम टाइम जब हम बात करते हैं नेशनलिज्म की, तो आई विल सम इट अप लाइक दिस कि जब ब्रिटिश हम पे राज करता था तो उसका हम पे राज करना एक तरह से उनका नेशनलिज्म था, और जब हम अपने आप को डिफेंड करते थे अपने स्वराज्य को, तो हमारा डिफेंड करना अपना नेशनलिज्म था. तो ये बोथ नेशनलिज्म, बट वो डिफरेंस कहाँ है वो इस एग्जाम्पल में आप देख सकते हैं. द सेकेंड टर्म जो आ जाता है हिंदू नेशनलिज्म. सो रिलीजन ने भी एक बहुत पार्ट प्ले किया हुआ है अब्राहमिक वर्ल्ड में, वेस्टर्न वर्ल्ड में. जब तक चर्च से स्टेट अलग नहीं हुआ था तब तक हमें पता है कि कितनी खूनी हिस्ट्री भी रही है और किस तरह से प्रोसिक्यूट भी हुए हैं जिनके भी अलग आइडियाज हुआ करते थे. तो आई थिंक समवेयर ये भी होता है कि जब ये दोनों वर्ड टुगेदर आते हैं तो वो इसको बहुत ही डेंजरस वे में अलर्ट हो जाता है उनका माइंड. सो अगर ऐसा होता है, लाइक हम कहाँ फेल होते हैं इस चीज को काउंटर करने में और अपनी बात उस इंटेलेक्चुअल वर्ल्ड तक पहुंचाने में? तो आई थिंक सूर्या, यू विल स्टार्ट एंड देन सागोरिका यू कैन आल्सो answer on that.
Yes, Amna. In fact, the way the narrative has been created anyway about nationalism is that that Indian nationalism does not have any sort of locus standi in the Western context, because they say that these people have many languages. They are not language is one of the main things that they look at when they say that the country is not unified. They said there's so many states, there's so many ethnicities, there's so many castes. That's another thing that they talk about. They say that the caste divisions in India make it such that the country is not unified. Now, what binds the country? They want to ignore that. What are the divisions in the country? They want to take that and say that this is the reason why it doesn't need to be a country. It happens to be one right now, and we happen to deal with it, but it is always an option because it has broken once. The fact is that it was colonized. It was first invaded. Second, it was colonized. Third, it was broken. So why does India have to be a viable entity in the long term? This mindset has been there since India gained independence, that it would not necessarily last. How to fix these sort of narratives? I think one is obviously just through economic and military strength. One is that naturally creates a narrative about the country. When you become stronger, the rest of the world starts respecting you. Second is there has to be a concerted effort to reach out to universities, to media groups, to think tanks, and people within governments. To help them understand the reason for India's existence, why it has been what India's civilization is all about, what India's pluralism is about, why Hindu nationalism, for somebody who subscribes to the ideology, why that ideology is actually pluralistic if it is implemented and looked at in a certain context, right? Because India has played host to people of various faiths for millennia. And this is not something that's going to change. The reason that that has happened, and for example, Jewish people, they've lived in India for more than 1,000 years. And there has been no persecution. Why? Because people, they have embraced them and said that you can live your own lives out here. That groups can be, they can be accommodated within India. There may not be the sort of bonding in some ways that may be there in the West. But the bonding that is there in the West is often within ethnic groups. In India, it can be across the idea that people can come in and get accommodated and feel safe. That is a reality. Now, when that pluralistic identity is assaulted from within or from outside, then there will be a backlash. And that backlash comes from sometimes within the country and sometimes through narratives. And the Western media and the Western intellectuals and academicians, they don't seem to understand this. And they don't understand why pluralism is something that must be upheld in India and what drives that pluralism. That pluralism is driven from the indigenous culture of the country. If that indigenous culture is attacked repeatedly, then there will be a problem. So I think that they are doing their bit to attack the indigenous culture. And because they want to sow, at some level, they want to sow discontent, which is why you see blatant disinformation being pushed by, for example, mainstream media outlets like Washington Post or New York Times, absolute lies. They attempt to gaslight the Indian reader, and not just the Indian reader. They want to portray an incorrect view of India to the Western audience, but they also want to tell Indians that their lived reality is wrong. So it's very nefarious, and it needs to be countered using literature that comes from India, with art, literature, films, documentaries, which show what the reality is. And even then, you cannot expect everyone to be convinced, but the internet is a powerful medium, and that's something which Indians must be able to harness.
I just want to add that point to you, and I felt that very personal, back home, growing up as a teenager who had interest in current affairs. I would read the Arundhati Roys and, the Caravans and all. And Outlook was, the favorite from the communist table. And I would never read that and go back and play with my friends. And still, as a thinking mind, I was like, what's going on here? I mean, apparently, according to Outlook, I'm like victimized and, my identity is at threat. And here I am having the time of my life, and friends are from the majority community. And, of course, your majority friends will be from the majority community. And that was a dilemma constantly. But back then, of course, as a teenager, you're still battling it, right? You're reading Roy, she's telling you, the genocide is coming, which she's been saying for 3 decades now. I mean, same dialogue, right? And she said it to Karan Thapar also 15 years back, that then 20 crore Muslims, they have their backs to the wall. And this is exactly what is getting replicated in the Western media. That, you guys, I mean, that's horrible. I mean, it's just like, the minorities are just going to get wiped out, and it's an unending assault, and then you have colonized minds within India saying that. I remember years back, Karan Thapar interviewed arguably India's most popular celebrity till now, Shah Rukh Khan, again a Muslim, and he said to him something about Muslims being very poor and all. And I remember Shah Rukh being very witty, and he said that's across religions in India. He was trying to bait him to it, but he didn't take the bait. And it's ironic how there are people within who actually become allies of the West outside, saying, yeah, it's screwed up, it's horrible. Yeah, Sagorika, if you could give your viewpoint.
No, Khalid, I just want to kind of ask you to check your privilege here. You don't understand the trauma that other Muslims probably face. No, I'm kidding. Please don't take that seriously. But Surya is right. everybody is sort of gaslit into ignoring their lived reality and believe what is written. I think it's an Abrahamic thought process also. Believe the written word. Ignore practices, ignore experiences, and believe the written word. So if it is written, you must believe it. And it is written, and I think Surya spoke about it on my channel as well, how it's weaponized as it's written once. It's cited in three different texts, and those three different texts are cited across decades by 350 other texts, which, you know, then get made into documentaries, get released as social media threads. You have influencers talking about it. So, you know, that's how an ecosystem is formed. And in answer to Amna's question, which I think is very important, आपने पूछा कि हम कहाँ चूक रहे हैं, है ना, क्योंकि हमारी जो narrative building है वो कैसे बन सकती है, क्योंकि ये सच्चाई नहीं है। बात यह है ना कि आपने वो ट्विटर का पता नहीं स्पेसेस का वो रिकॉर्डिंग देखा है कि नहीं, वो बहुत was very illuminating. That person who was talking about how dirty tricks were employed against Modi, against the Modi government, because he was seen as adversarial to Western interests. At least he wasn't always in line with regards to Western, because, you know, India's got her own interests. But $30 million is cited as the sum, you know, that is given solely by the state, not by Soros, not by Omidyar. I mean, maybe indirectly through them, but this is through the State Department to Atlantic Council, to USAID, to Global Engagement Center, as well as to mercenary groups under the guise of digital resilience. And I'm kind of quoting ad verbatim exactly what was said, that, you know, fact-checking digital resilience is essentially so that any nationalist or any person trying to explain their perspective the way Surya said does not gain share of mind. Essentially, that their hearts and minds are already captured by all these people, because that's a lot of money. Imagine India, the Indian state, giving 30 million. Now, I would say that, okay, you give $30 million, or maybe we don't even need 30, because ours is not lie-based. Where, you know, if you have to impose something that's untrue, you need a lot more resources. If you have to impose something that connects generally with people, you'd probably need maybe $5 million, right? It's not hard to come by. Like, any startup would probably get that in a week. Like, startups across Bangalore would get that in across a week. But the thing is, it requires a vision. Our vision is not very coherent always. There's groups of people, and that's I think a condition of time. We've not spent a lot of time thinking about it, being at a place where, you know, coming from a fragile 5 economy to the third largest economy in the world, it's happened quickly, and we need to adjust our expectations. I am tired of it. I'm impatient as well, and I think it's a bit of an excuse. I think there's a lot of independent creators and a lot of people who have the money, and there needs to be a connect between these two people. And the Indian state would best be either very far behind the scenes or not involved, because there has to be an overarching narrative. Understand the fault lines. One, things like caste is going to be used against us forever. Now, the Kulajati Varna system, which I have written about, is not the European caste system, which is based in racism. That's a miscommunication that has hindered progress intellectually for decades, for generations, and that's weaponized against India. If a Westerner uses caste, please understand it's against the Hindu population, it's against an Indian population. It holds Indians hostage wherever they have made, wherever they've prospered. You've seen that in the US with the SB 403 bill being passed in Seattle and California being accepted there. So this is terrible for Indians because it just creates another caste as a fault line. You have to have that narrative that you're wrong about these things. You can't pick out one fringe incident happening and then paint it as India is casteist, because you don't do that with any other country, any other population. You don't say that, you don't take those incidents and look, our population is large. So maybe 0.0003% of the population doing something will result in a larger number than somebody else is used to seeing. That does not make it common, not for Indians at least, right?
You know, it's interesting you spoke about how caste lines are, exploited, and then, it's these insinuations or direct attacks are made that how most of the Hindus are castists and, lower castes are at a problem. But yet again, I mean, we have Amana here. She comes from lower caste Pasmanda Muslim, right? That is not only denied, I mean, it is said that nothing like that exists. And when she puts out that reality, the pushback is from the very forces who want to paint India as this very casteist place. But now we are saying, okay, let's take your argument ahead. There's casteism amongst Muslims as well, amongst Christians as well, amongst Sikhs as well. We had Puneet Sahani once speak about, how blatant it is. Maybe it's not that structuralized, but it is there. And like Amana says, in the case of Muslims and as her living reality, it's not even acknowledged. That's how horrible it is. I mean, the word Julaha was even once used for as popular as a cricket as Mohammad Kaif, or the slurs which are used towards Amna, where she cannot, use the SC/ST Act to go against the people. So just wanted to add that, because even in that, there is this dishonesty, intellectual dishonesty, where they are not saying, okay, let's talk about the next big four, religions in India and how casteism works there. But they wouldn't want to associate every second Muslim as a casteist or every second Indian Christian or a Sikh, who are substantial populations amongst themselves. 25 crore Indian Muslims are just 10 crores less than the US population, right? And it's the second or third highest Muslim population for any country in the world. Which brings me to another question, Surya, is that all these facts are there for the world to see. India has the arguably first or second highest number of mosques for any country in the world, even though it's a Hindu majority, 25 crore Muslims, which is the second or third highest Muslim population, 5 crore Christians, 5 crore Sikhs. I mean, this huge Parsis, Jews and all. Is the average American oblivious to this, or has the state played a role where he has wanted constantly these facts to be kept aside, which is quite a gigantic task, but they have done well? And I want to get your statement. You, in one of your tweets, said that sometimes what the US government chooses not to say officially, they get their State Department mouthpiece, Foreign Affairs, to say it. And you gave the example of how there is a similar law in which, our Foreign Minister, Mr. Jaishankar, also spoke about. The Citizenship Amendment Act, the CAA, is like the Lautenberg Amendment, which gives, relief to the persecuted, particular religious identities. Is then there a diabolical game played by US? Like they said, the worst, if you're an enemy, but the worst thing is to be a friend of US. So how does all this work into the setup of they feeding their media and then getting all this through their State Department?
That's a really good question, Khalid, because the US has many different lobby groups, and they have almost formalized lobbying. It's officially allowed in the US in different ways. And beyond those official lobby groups, there are special interest groups which are funded by private foundations and which have their tentacles in media organizations, in think tanks. And in this case, when we look at, say, Foreign Affairs, which is a magazine of the Council for Foreign Relations, which is a State Department think tank, I don't think one can say for sure that an article written in Foreign Affairs is going to necessarily be a reflection of what the State Department thinks. But the timing of such a piece 1 week before the Prime Minister is visiting the US is interesting when you know that the piece is riddled with misinformation, with factual inaccuracies. The fact is that the CAA was not going to strip anyone of citizenship from who is already an existing citizen of the country. The Lautenberg Amendment it's been told ad nauseum to them that on social media and through articles that look, this amendment provides succor to persecuted minorities in India's immediate neighborhood, and they are religious minorities in those countries, in theocracies next door. You can repeat it till the cows come home, but they will not be interested in listening to the facts and reporting the facts. And the reason that they do this is because they think that they can put pressure in some way. They can influence some lawmakers in the US, they can influence other journalists in the US, and also some people in India, and create a perception before an official state visit, even if it requires the use of disinformation. And the very fact that this can happen at a relatively well-known outlet, then I mean, I've seen many articles in Foreign Affairs which clearly do not, cite the truth. In fact, I think this is well known. We have to also remember the U.S. waged a war in Iraq based on lies. So, an article that comes out of foreign affairs not having the truth in it, I think that we can just take that as a part and parcel of how the U.S.
BBC and
operates.
CNN all trumping it up that there is weapons of mass destruction, and then after millions died, they were like, "Oh, sorry, we got it wrong."
Exactly. I mean, this happens. It's happened on a scale which has actually cost more than 1.5 million lives. We see it repeatedly. I mean, the narrative about India has been false in many cases, and on Wall Street Journal, there's a reporter who had lied about what happened in Delhi during the riots, anti-CAA riots, and that journalist has still not faced the law. I mean, it has been proven. He basically quoted an individual saying that, basically the entire quote was fabricated. And this came in the Wall Street Journal, and that has not been retracted, and the journalist has not been brought to book. I mean, this use of disinformation is a part of how the Americans operate. Not always, but it does happen. And it's something we can continue to expect. The Chinese do it. The Germans do it. I don't read too much French media, but I would assume that every country does it to some degree.
Garofalo is French.
Yeah, well, he does it, and he writes books as well. So, I mean, the thing is that it gets to a point where we live in a post-truth world, where there is no real, where the waters have to be muddied so much that nobody knows what the truth is. And the job of a lot of these organizations and these people is to just try and indoctrinate and influence. The truth does not matter. In the US, the woke movement is an anti-truth movement. It says that there is no absolute truth. Everything is relative. Morals are relative. Truth is relative. If that happens, if that is the case, then anything can be justified, depending on who is in power. And this is very convenient, and it works to the advantage of that government in the United States that is currently there. And it will be used in a different way by another government. One government may say that I have brute power, so I will do whatever I want, brazenly. The other will say that I am taking a moral stand, even if it is an amoral stand, because they can twist the truth. And this is the world that we have to deal with. These are the sort of forces that we have to deal with from a position of saying that we want to be a Thermic State. We want to uphold our civilizational values in a changing world order. When we are faced with this sort of, I would say, adharma.
So I will ask like 2-3 questions together because काफी लंबी बातचीत लगी थी और मैं सब पे ध्यान रख रही थी. सबसे पहले सूर्या, आपने बोला धार्मिक स्टेट. सो आई थिंक आप प्लीज वो धार्मिक स्टेट के बारे में थोड़ा सा डिटेल एक डिस्क्रिप्शन बताइए, बिकॉज जब धार्मिक स्टेट की बात आती है, इवन जब वर्ड हिंदू की बात आती है, तो बहुत सारी उसके आसपास एम्बिग्यूटी रहती है. बिकॉज when a lot of people think about a religious state, they think from the perspective of जो वेस्ट में हुआ है कि जहाँ स्टेट एंड रिलीजन चर्च मिल जाते हैं. ऑल्सो हिंदू वर्ड एक कल्चर की बात भी होती है. इट्स नॉट ओनली अबाउट द रिलीजन, बिकॉज हिंदू रिलीजन बना ही तब जब बाहर से लोग आए, तब ये डिफाइन किया गया कि हिंदू कल्चर नहीं, अब एक रिलीजन भी है. ये इस पे थोड़ा सा ध्यान दें. दूसरा, धार्मिक स्टेट में जो सबसे बड़ा क्वेश्चन लोग करते हैं वो होता है माइनॉरिटी की क्या स्थिति रहेगी. मतलब व्हाट विल बी देयर राइट प्रिजर्व, क्या उनके राइट होंगे या फिर वो सेकंड क्लास सिटीजन बन जाएंगे. थर्ड क्वेश्चन, मतलब मैंने काफी लोगों से बात की यहाँ पर भी, तो दे ऑल्सो आस्क व्हाई दिस इज नीडेड. क्या जो अभी इंडिया का कॉन्स्टिट्यूशन है उसमें वो हर चीज एबिलिटी नहीं है टू डू द सेम थिंग जिसके लिए हमें धार्मिक स्टेट की जरूरत पड़ेगी. सो दीज आर 3 क्वेश्चन. जो नेक्स्ट मेरा क्वेश्चन है, सॉरी लाइक इट्स बीन वेरी लॉन्ग, मतलब ज्यादा हो जाएंगे बट मैं भूल जाऊंगी. तो सागरिका जिस पे बात कर रही थी कि इंडियन हिंदू का जो डायस्पोरा है वो एक पॉलिटिकली कलेक्टिवली आकर के अपनी बात नहीं रख पाते हैं, वो बहुत ही इंडिविजुअलिस्टिक हो जाते हैं. उसमें मैंने एक चीज और नोटिस की है, यहाँ पे जब मैं यूके में भी कुछ ऑर्गेनाइजेशन से मिली तो मुझे बहुत हैरानी हुई कि जो वो लोग मिलते हैं और जो भी चीजें वो साथ में करते हैं, दैट्स लाइक यूके के हिंदू, इंडियन हिंदू। तो मैंने उनको पूछा कि व्हाई देयर आर नॉट इंडियन मुस्लिम्स ज्वाइनिंग योर ऑर्गेनाइजेशन और पार्टिसिपेटिंग, इंडियन क्रिश्चियंस, इंडियन बहुत सारे हैं, सिख हैं, बहुत लोग हैं, बट बिकॉज यू हैव दिस थिंग, ये आपका पावर है, तो ये लोग क्यों नहीं आपके ऑर्गेनाइजेशन में आके बात करते हैं, इंडिया के लिए बोलते हैं। इनफैक्ट हम देखते हैं कि खालिस्तानियों को बहुत ज्यादा सपोर्ट मिल जाता है एंड उनकी एक ऑर्गेनाइजेशन बन जाती है। इंडियन मुस्लिम काउंसलिंग करके इन अमेरिका बन जाती है। जब इंडियन स्टेट के खुद के इंडियन सिटीजन है डिफरेंट डिफरेंट रिलीजन के, वो क्यों नहीं जोड़ पाते उनको प्रो इंडियन ऑर्गेनाइजेशन में आउट ऑफ इंडिया? सो वहां पे हम कैसे फेल होते हैं? सो ये 4 क्वेश्चंस हैं, आई वुड लाइक टू थोड़ा थोड़ा आंसर, बिकॉज बहुत लंबा हो जाएगा वन।
Sure. I'll just talk first in general about this idea of a dharmic state. Now, obviously, each person has their own interpretation of what this could be, but I think broadly the idea is the dharma is that which keeps things in balance. Now, when we're talking about a society that must be kept in balance, we are looking at making sure that there are fundamental rights that are bestowed upon every person, right? Otherwise, your society is imbalanced. Now, when we talk about preservation of even this fundamental idea, you can say that the Constitution preserves it, but the Constitution actually treats what we have as the indigenous culture of India as a religion which is the same as other religions in the world, and which exist within India, and say that because we are using English nomenclature to define what a religion is, and then at the same time, Hindu temples are exclusively under government control. There are personal laws for people of certain faiths. And I think that there's discrimination fundamentally in the modern Indian state based on religion, based on community and caste. We can call it reservation, but it was not supposed to, in theory, according to one of the proponents of the reservation system, was not supposed to last beyond a fixed period of time. But we have a system which has now morphed into something which is much more political, because it has very strong political effect on elections and the way people vote. And I think that does great disservice to democracy at some level. While the importance there is, and there must be, and the state must make an effort to create equal opportunities for all citizens, equal outcomes cannot be guaranteed. We know that, everyone knows that, but in this so-called attempt to create equality in society, I think there's a lot of damage that's being done, and I don't think that is a dharmic approach to treating one's citizens correctly, right? I think it requires a complete overhaul in the way that we look at the legal system, at what we think we need to protect. If a country knows why it exists and can recognize why it exists, in fact, we do recognize in some way India, that is Bharat. The term Bharat is a civilizational term. It is something that predates most nation states in the world by hundreds and hundreds of years. So the idea of Bharat is actually something which, if we fully embraced, we would say that what makes Bharat what it is, or even the term what it is a cultural identity. That means that we must protect that cultural identity. That means we must identify anything that threatens that, whether it is, for example, money that flows into the country from outside for conversions. Why can you not have in India an Atmanirbhar freedom of religion, for freedom of proselytization? Any money that is going for proselytization should be from within the country. Why should you be allowed to bring money from outside, from richer countries, where per capita GDP is higher, where funds are freely available, and put that money into India and allow that to be used for conversions? Because when that happens, then you're not allowing Indians to organically decide, using their own resources, what religion they want to choose, what way of life they want to choose. If you do it from within the country, using resources from within the country, then you will see what the real outcomes are. And you're giving the freedom through this, right? You're not imposing anything on anyone, but you're saying that it needs to be indigenous. This idea that we can be self-reliant in determining how we look at ourselves. We don't need to call ourselves a liberal democracy, a Western liberal democracy. We are an Eastern pluralist democracy. Our democracy is used to serve very specific end goals for our people. It is not a showpiece for the West. It is not a showpiece for anyone. Just the label. The label is something that we can be changed at any point in time. The goalposts shift constantly in the West. They say that we are going to say that you are no longer a democracy, or you're an electoral autocracy, or something like this. They'll just change the goalposts, change your rankings, and then say that you are something else. So, I mean, we have the idea of an Eastern pluralist democracy is something which is indigenous to our country. And when you say that that is taking into account individual rights and making sure that everybody has all the basic rights that they should have, nobody is being discriminated against, but you recognize why you exist. That itself goes a long way to establishing what I would say is a Dharmic state. That is, and I think, going into to next point, and I don't want to go on for too long, but the point about why Indians are not, they don't necessarily join organizations that promote Indian, Indian causes. I think that Hindus by nature, and especially the groups, the people who go abroad, they are economic migrants in most cases. They seek to better their lives and the lives of their families, and perhaps their own community that they live in. They identify as Indians. They identify with whatever religion they may have, they may belong to, but their main goal is to create the best opportunities for themselves. It's very individualistic. And the groupthink is not there because they don't draw power from being in a group. They draw power from being individually successful and supporting their family. So in many cases, that's why you see, that's exactly why Indians don't form a vote bank in most places. That's why they're not politically powerful in many countries, because they don't vote and block, because they don't have this groupthink. It's both our strength and our weakness. And I think that in some ways it has become a weakness overseas because you don't have that political power to push back against what is sometimes clearly blatant anti-Hindu sort of even legislation, for example, that you see in the US. Or
Especially.
Sorry?
In Seattle lately, the anti-caste,
Exactly. I mean, it takes a lot to rally people together, and then one person comes out, or a few people say that no, we are pro this, pro the bill, then it becomes a thing that, oh, Indians do not have enough unity. You guys are not on the same page. So then that becomes the issue, that you're not on the same page. And that's because your country is too diverse, you have too many ideas, and frankly, you don't need to be a country. That can also be an argument, right? Because everything is weaponized. Diversity is weaponized. Diversity, and they talk about diversity, right? Talking about including more people in various backgrounds within organizations. Think about what diversity really means at its core. Diversity is meant to bring new ideas on board, ideas which may not have been represented. Traditionally, we would try and bring people who can inject these fresh thoughts into a system, whether it's a company or an institution. If you start bringing what you call Hindu nationalist ideas into any institution, will that be considered okay? Legitimate diversity? It's not legitimate diversity. Because they don't want to know what India's what the idea of a Hindu Rashtra really is, or a Dharmic state is. Do they want to hear what we have to say? No, not necessarily, because they want to live in their own world, and they want to say that this is how the Hindu nationalists are. This is what the BJP is about. And they think that all Hindu nationalists are BJP supporters. They try and reduce everything for an audience which clearly does not know much about India. I mean, I live in Switzerland. If you ask people, what do they know about India? They don't know a whole lot. Look in the US, how many people, what percentage of the population even knows about Narendra Modi? Around, 60% of the population has even heard of him. The audience is actually the decision makers. The audience are actually the Indian people, the Indian elite of all their narratives. Their audience is not even the American masses. To some extent it is, but not always. Yeah.
I want to add one thing about the Dharmic nation. One of the things that you asked about the constitution, the Akhil Bharat, the Hindu Mahasabha, Akhil Bharat Hindu Mahasabha constitution already stated that the first point is to remove all forms of inequalities and disabilities, and thus to establish an order in which all nationals will enjoy equal opportunities to serve the state. So there is nothing unlike in Pakistan, there is no differentiation of who holds power, who holds office, who serves, just like in India. That's just an example of something that was previously decided for a Thermic State. Yeah.
Sagarika, your question that why are Hindus politically not as one unit in places like US, UK, Canada, Australia, and why other communities do that, and because of which they're not politically as powerful, and they're not able to take the fight to the.
I actually want to explain this question properly. Look,
Sure.
I have seen a lot of organization like Indian Muslims in America, Indian Muslims in इस तरह के organization, and I was checking their member. Indian Muslim in UK में एक भी ऐसा मुस्लिम नहीं है जो UK में रहता है. They have registered it in the name of like this, and all the people are from India somewhere. पता नहीं कौन कौन है. So then you realize that these are like sham organization in the name of, but then वो anti India propaganda करेंगे और उसके पीछे उनका funding वगैरह, whatever is the reason. But ये लोग जब ऐसा नाम भी रखते हैं ना, तब भी ये लोग बड़े अच्छे से कहते हैं कि हम तो human rights की बात कर रहे हैं. They never make it about only, we're not talking about only the tribalism or Indian Muslim, we're talking about human rights. And उनको allies बहुत अच्छे से बनाने आते हैं. मतलब to be very fair, majority of the Muslims, I won't say every Muslim, but बहुत सारे Muslims हैं और organization है जो LGBTQ values को accept नहीं करते हैं. बट वो LGBT पीपल्स के साथ जाकर के अपना अलायंस बना लेते हैं फॉर सर्टेन कॉज, वो साथ में आ जाते हैं. सो लाइक आई सी एवरीवन ऑन इन द इंटरनेशनल प्लेटफॉर्म प्लेइंग लाइक दिस वेरी सक्सेसफुली. कम्युनिस्ट एंड इस्लामिस्ट साथ में आ जाते हैं, बट आई सी इंडियन पीपल फेलिंग एट दैट फ्रंट वेरी बैडली. अगर कोई ऑर्गेनाइजेशन है जहां पर कि इंडियन हिंदू के राइट्स की बात की जाती है या हिंदू राइट्स की बात की जाती है, हिंदू और जगह पे बहुत प्रोसिक्यूट भी हो रहे हैं, बट वो इस तरह के अलायंस नहीं बना पाते हैं. इवन इंडियन हिंदू ऑर्गेनाइजेशन मैं यूके में देख रही हूँ, वो अपने साथ इंडियन मुस्लिम्स डायस्पोरा, इंडियन सिख डायस्पोरा, इंडियन जो कि हमारी स्ट्रेंथ है विद इन इंडिया, वो रहते हैं और वो होंगे भी, मतलब इंडियन इंडिया को प्रो इंडिया होंगे, नेशनलिस्ट होंगे, पैट्रियोटिक होंगे, बट उनको जोड़ नहीं पाते हैं. तो मुझे समझ नहीं आता कि आर वी वेरी नाइव इन दैट गेम, यू कैन से, और हाउ वी आर फेलिंग एट इट. क्यों हम इतने बुरी तरह से फेल होते हैं, ये मुझे समझ नहीं आता. सो आई मीन इफ यू कैन हैव सम इनसाइट ओवर दैट क्वेश्चन.
आपके प्रश्न काफी अच्छे हैं. मैंने इस पर एक आर्टिकल में लिखा भी है. मैंने अगर उसमें थोड़ा सा कोट करूं तो मैंने ये लिखा था कि the Hindu diaspora in the US remains largely unaware of the hate campaigns against them. Unlike the rallying cries of Islamophobia that were weaponized quickly, Hinduphobia is incredibly normalized in Western societies. Absolute assimilation involves desensitization towards disparity to a great extent. इसका ये मतलब है कि अगर आपके अगेंस्ट कुछ बोला जा रहा है आज कि अरे यार तुम लोग तो बहुत स्मेली खाना खाते हो, आप क्या करोगे? हंसोगे. हाँ, मतलब हाँ हम तो थोड़ा मसाला ज्यादा करते हैं, है ना. वो बोलो कि साले तुम लोग इतना सफेद खाना खाते हो, सॉरी फॉर माय लैंग्वेज, बट you don't respond in kind. We are always too defensive, we're too nice. And you know what? I don't think that's wrong at an individual level. When you find yourself threatened, when you find a part of your identity threatened, that's when that response should occur. It does not, because what happens is, like Surya said, these are economic migrants. They went with that mindset. They never imagined India would have this power. They never imagined that thus Hindus would have a resurgence. So they do not understand Hindu revivalism in terms of politics. So I think we can forgive them for it, but at the same time continue to educate them about the opportunities. You've seen the massive lines that were queuing up to meet the prime minister, and this happens across the world. The diaspora population is crazy about him for good reason, with good reason, right? You have relatives living back home. यार जब हम लोग मतलब क्या नहीं देखा यार, मतलब जान हथेली में लेकर मैं ट्रेन में जब जाती थी कि रोज मम्मी पापा का फोन आएगा कि बेटा आज वो थ्रेट अलर्ट आया है बॉम्ब का, ध्यान रखना, कॉलेज से कब आओगी। फोन भी नहीं था, मतलब आपको पता है कि फोन की कितनी असुविधा होती थी और आपको कितने पैसे देने पड़ते थे। रोज रोज ये सुनते हैं आप, और उसके बाद आज के तारीख में मतलब ऐसे कोई डर नहीं है। किसी को ये याद नहीं है कि गांव में मतलब जाना ही था, पावर हमारा 7 बजे, 7 कहाँ 5 बजे चली जाती थी, तो हम लोग खुश होते थे कि अंधेरे में हाँ मच्छर कैसे भगाएंगे, कौन कौन बच्चा किसके। अब वहां से लेकर we are not finding the latest iPad for our sons, 1-year-old sons, feeding time. That's the problem. That's what you have to contend with. So the older generations retain those memories, right? The ones who've seen that, and you've not completely lost out on that. So these are the people who are going to these diaspora meetups. Can we educate them about the threats that they face? Because we lack in that. This SB 403 is not the call to unity that it should have been, yet it saw some pushback. अब इसके बारे में कौन लिख रहा है? मैं लिख रही हूँ। मैं इंडिया में बैठ के लिखकर क्या करूंगी इसके बारे में? कोई यूएस में लिखे, कोई ब्लूम्सबरी में पब्लिश करे, WSJ में पब्लिश करे, बट वो लोग किसको बुलाते हैं? बरखा दत्त को, माइकल कुगलमैन को, क्रिस्टीन फेयर को। अब आप जानते हैं कि इन्हीं को प्लेटफॉर्म मिलेगा। तो now, this is an example. Falun Gong is a banned Chinese organization, but they start media organizations everywhere. And आपने बहुत प्रश्न पूछे थे उस समय, इसमें हम फेल हो जाते। आपने जो प्रश्न पूछे ना उस समय मुझे कुछ याद आ रहे थे. Why this happens? One of the things is, and I've repeated this in several places, I always find that, oh, by the way, आपने communism, Islamism, or ये woke and LGBTQ, IA2S plus population and Islam together. इस पे आश्रा नोमानी जी ने एक पुस्तक लिखी है, and I did want to discuss it with her, but वो थोड़ा चल रहा है. But this is something that has been in discussion. She's been on Rajiv Malhotra's channel as well to discuss it. So you're very right in spotting that. Most people miss it. अब उनको क्या दिखता है कि जब finally उनके गांव में जाएगा, which is a Muslim majority town in the US, when you finally have the pride flag supposed to be there, वो तो block कर दिए हैं, नहीं allowed है. Because unka,
I'm so surprised about that.
Yeah, I know, right? Because they are very sure of their identity. Now, the Hindus are not certain of their identity. They feel embarrassed associating with Hinduism publicly. Because for them, they have ingrained the Western view of paganism as something dirty. They use their skin color, they use some facets of their religion to exoticize themselves to the point that they can be fetishized by the West. But they cannot use it to build a cohesive political force until they identify it with the same victimhood supremacist mindset that everybody else does. Until that happens, we will be nowhere. And another thing is, I always say this, is that they are united by hate. We are divided by purpose. You see how many people exist, how many influential Hindus exist in the world. There are tons of us. We all have different purposes. Even people in the same space speaking about dharmic causes, speaking about the rise of Bharat, speaking about a Thermic State. Everybody's got different agendas because, you use a certain jargon. Okay, we are the neo-Ambedkarites. We stand for only Sanatan Seva. I don't know. I'm just coming up with these as I go.
What was the word you used, that they are united by hate and we are divided by?
Purpose. We all have different purposes.
It's a different purpose, okay.
So, you have a purpose to discuss geopolitics, but would you stand for, I actually think, I know that you would, Amana and Khalid have and will continue to stand for stand against any of the lies pushed against India and against Hindus in the West. But you know that is not true of most people. It's not just in the West, it's even in India. You have so many creators. अब यार आदि पुरुष जैसे मूवी को लेकर लग गए कि हम ना बोल रहे, हम हाँ बोल रहे, कौन किसको who is together, who is against it, कर रहा है तो कर रहा है, नहीं कर रहा है तो नहीं कर रहा है, किसी को पैसे मिले उसको प्रमोट जाने दो. There is a requirement of casual indifference when it comes to disagreeing on certain things and moving ahead. Now, if you see the others, they will never speak against one another. They understand this essence of an ecosystem. And see, I can disagree with Surya. What I will do on a certain point, there's few of them, but very few of them. So what we'll do is we'll have a direct message, or we will call each other, try to understand each other's perspective, and then have a public discussion about it. Or we will discuss something that is, if we disagree on certain things, it will be much more nuanced. उनका क्या है कि वो नहीं publicly तो disagree नहीं करेंगे. सिर्फ एक मतलब कोई नहीं करता है. यहाँ पे आपको कहाँ मिलता है, एक जन कुछ बोला, वो like the crabs out of a bucket, somebody is dragging everybody else is dragging. So there's still an individualist approach. Maybe it is a matter of time because we haven't built an idea of an ecosystem. अभी आप देखिए comments में कितने लोग बोलते हैं, अरे ये तो मतलब I don't know, they'll find something to be negative about.
No,
right?
I'll just give you abhi taza example. You have a popular right-wing influencer in Shefali Vaidya, and she just differed with the audience Amna, saying
on Adi Purush.
Yeah, on Adi Purush, saying ki theek hai, Om Raut ka work I liked in Tanaji, and give him a chance. Maybe I'm naive, maybe he's done a bad job. She, who's of course quite privileged, was attacked so badly that someone with her who battles it day in and out, she was said that bhai tumne to paise liye is tweet ke liye, tumne post ke liye tweet liye paise liye, and then she had to put out a disclaimer tweet post saying ki I don't need to do that, and they were fighting amongst each other. Whereas if you look at the mafia on the other side, if Arfa comes to power, Kavita Krishnal jail mein jayegi. If Kavita comes to power, Arfa jail mein jayegi. But as a mafia, they maintain that honor. They won't take down each other in front of the public,
Right.
Even though it's a communist Islamist. So just wanted to add on that front,
नहीं, तो that is
our side is like everyone's there to put you down,
हाँ.
crap in the bucket ki अरे ये nationalist अब थोड़ा ज़्यादा नाम बढ़ रहा है. Even amongst the influencers, नीचे लाओ नीचे.
Exactly. इतने purposes नहीं होने चाहिए किसी के. जैसे अगर आपको कोई नहीं पसंद है, पर you understand that they are trying to serve a cause. You try to figure out why you disagree with that part, why they agree with it, and leave it be. Because everybody does not have to agree with you 100%. What kind of a world is that? We'd be communists then, no, censoring everything and, essentially creating robotic minds. We aren't, groupthink is not part of everybody else's way of being. So we should accept that. But ye jo united by hate, hey, it's very easy. You don't understand. Divided by purpose is something. So until we have a sense of othering, that India ko kuch bol diya, मेरे हिंदू भाइयों को, हिंदू बहनों को कुछ बोल दिया, तो आप उनको विक्टिमाइज कर रहे हैं. आप उनके इतने मिलेनिया ओल्ड घाव पर फिर से नमक छिड़क रहे हैं. वो वाली सोच. एंड प्लीज अंडरस्टैंड दैट दिस इज नॉट Muslims and Indian Christians are not exempt from this duty. Why does somebody digging out a relic in the Philippines not take money for it, sends it directly back to Bharat, because he thinks that that is the soul of Bharat, that is an identity, that is something associated with Bharat. We don't need money for it. We have to give this back to Indians who need it. Why do the Indonesians win awards with Ramayana rewritings? They will protect their culture. They will call their airlines Garuda. They will have a huge statue of Jatayu. So why are Indian Muslims, Indian Sikhs, Indian Christians exempt from this, from understanding that an attack? What do you think? once the Hindus are done for, they will be safe.
Right. So
Yeah.
wanted to understand this, Surya, like even we see with regards to Prime Minister Modi, right? I mean, the propaganda campaign by the US lobbies, many of which you said, like Atlantic Council, are heavily infested by, Pakistani agents. The propaganda initially to deny him to come to US, and now that seems to have come a full circle with, as you said in one of your tweets, Financial Times own Nikki, Nikkei, has said that, ultimately India did the right thing, how India's Modi helped save the West by buying Russian oil. This is the headlines in Nikki, which you said is owned by the Financial Times. That to what was the narrative 10, 20 years before, that mass murderer, we won't allow him to US, it seems to have come a full circle. Today he met with, the who's who, from Elon Musk to Neil deGrasse Tyson, and of course everyone else. How has this change happened? Would we credit the the think tanks back in India, the security establishment, the ones who are helping with the counter narratives? And could you just drive us that which were initially the groups which were involved in, like, I mean, we know Indian American Muslim Council, that's been at the top propaganda. Even today they protest as we speak, about this, and a lot of lies out there. There's a genocide of Muslims going on and all. So if you could talk us about that, and this would be our last to wrap it up, and then Sagar.
Yeah, sure, Khalid. You see, this thing about narratives about the India purchasing oil from Russia, there was a concerted effort by several media groups for nearly, you would say, a year. Every few weeks or every month, there would be some article or another that would come out criticizing India for purchasing Russian crude and insinuating that India is financing Russia's war against Ukraine. Now, the evidence was there from day one that when India buys Russian crude, they basically are they're increasing the supply of non-Russian crude in the global markets, and they're making sure that prices don't go too high. You already have a problem with inflation in the West. It's there in India as well, but it's much more in the West. If energy inflation continued at the sort of level that was there during the war, or in the few months after the war began, it would have been a wrecking ball through the Western economies. This was known from day one. It took more than a year for them to come around and say that, look, India is actually helping essentially tame energy inflation. Why did they choose now? They chose the moment now to say that, look, we are finally accepting this after 1 year. And we're writing an article before the Prime Minister is visiting the US. That means that at the time of our choosing, we will decide to put forward the truth. Until this point, we can say whatever we want. We can basically obfuscate, we can blame India for something, and then finally we can say the truth, and you will have to take it. That this is the way that the media tries to show dominance over a country, over a narrative about a country, by saying we can say anything anytime, and then we can turn around and say something. If we want to tell the truth, we will. If we don't want to, we don't need to. And when we do tell the truth, your people will come and cite our article for their own validation, for them to feel that they have done the right thing, despite us saying anything for 1 year. This is how they intellectually manipulate the audience. And they know that this is not being read by probably more than about 80-90% of India. It is going to be read by a few million people at best, and will be cited by people from the government at some level. They will read it. They will all know that this article has come out, and they'll be like, oh, finally these guys have acknowledged it. Do we really have to care whether they acknowledge the truth or not? Because most of these organizations, they do not operate based on truth. I mean, this is the reality of the media. They are manipulators of information, manipulators of narratives to suit very specific political agendas. And I don't want to sound like a conspiracy theorist, but I'm just trying to use this as an example to say that how they are trying to manipulate the audience. And I think that, the point about different lobby groups in the US trying to, there was the other question. I think I don't want to name any one specific organization. I think we know a lot of them. The fact remains that they will continue to do their job. I saw a piece that was written by, I think it was Duke University Press or University of Pennsylvania. I'll find it actually and send it to you. It's about how to protest in between elections. So they are preparing actually for a time when maybe this government comes back to power again and wins the 2024 elections, and then how to disrupt during those 5 years. There's a whole template, academic study of how it was done in some states in southern India and how this model can be replicated in other parts of the country. Now, disruption there's a whole industry. The protest industry is real. And this will, and they know how to turn things on and off in India, because they know that the government will have less and less tolerance for violent flare-ups on the streets. So they will try as much as they can. Their propaganda in the US matters much less than their propaganda inside India, because that has real material consequences on the ground. And those consequences will ultimately have an impact on how policy is made. For example, the farm laws. The same countries that have free markets for agricultural products, the media outlets in those countries which support capitalist sort of reform, free market reforms, those guys were anti-farm bills. Why were they anti-farm bills in India? They were anti-farm bills because they knew that this will unleash another huge amount of economic productivity. They want to stop economic progress. Why was Raghuram Rajan, and why is he anti-manufacturing? These people want to stop the progress of the country, and they will do anything as much as they can. And when they're out of power, they're frustrated. When they're out of power, their sponsors are frustrated. So the best case scenario is to disrupt on the ground using protests, using a narrative, fake narratives, to say, for example, Muslims will be stripped of their citizenship, so go onto the streets. Sikhs are being targeted because the government wants to institute a free market reform. So push that narrative. Use identity, use policy, combine them together, and make it sound that the government is targeting you. And then bring people out onto the road, and then disrupt, cause financial damage, physical damage where possible, and then make the government walk back on things, and then stop the country's progress. They will keep doing this. We can expect more of it. And at some level, I'm sure there will be discussions between some people in the government and some officials in other countries about what this disruption is really about. But there's always this sense that they can deflect the blame and say that, look, these are private media groups, private foundations. It has nothing to do with the government. And I guess that can be, that plausible deniability is something they can mention. But I don't know how much we should believe that denial. So
it's like the non-state actors of Pakistan.
Yes, in a different way, that's what they are. The Chinese were able to close off this entire circus by having a communist state with the Great Firewall, the internet firewall, by having the sort of control that they have over the country. India is an open society where people are allowed to come in and do, not anything they want to, but, they have access and they have freedom. And that freedom is abused. No other democracy, have we seen any democracy in the world rise to the power to challenge, for example, the US? China, as a communist state, has done it. The USSR in the past has done it. India is the only country that has the potential to become another China as a democracy. Democracy has been used, for example, whether it's Germany or Japan. These countries became economic powers. They were defanged militarily. They did not have the military capabilities. They became economic powers, but then they kind of started declining. They've fallen way behind the US. The only country that has managed to catch up economically to a large extent is China. Do they want another democratic country? Who would want another democratic country to come onto the the scene and be able to say that, look, we have a GDP equivalent to China and equivalent to the US at some point. Nobody would want that. It's too much. Democracy is used as a tool to prevent progress. The Americans weaponize democracy to prevent the progress of other countries in many cases. They claim that it's because they shift the goalposts. They talk about shared values, but it's not always about shared values. Sometimes it is. Sometimes it is about actually shared values, and I see it. But when they choose to weaponize democracy against you, they will do it, and we see it. They weaponize your open system.
Introduce closed systems into that very open system.
Sorry?
Introduce closed systems into that very open system and hence exploit that very open system.
Yeah. I mean, they use, for example, like a Soros, a media network. Highly well, they use the financial asymmetry that they have versus, say, other actors to be able to spin narratives, to be able to create problems, to spread disinformation. And they're also quite worried about one thing, and I just want to end on this note. They're very worried about one thing, that India has one of the largest English-speaking populations in the world. We go online and we tweet, we write. Our voice can become very loud, and there'll be a lot of people who will be speaking in the English language, almost more than the entire English-speaking world together.
Absolutely.
Do they want our voice to be heard? And to what extent do they want our voice to be heard? Because the gatekeepers, the fact checkers, they're gatekeepers of information, right? Your universities are gatekeepers of information and knowledge. What they decide, do they want Indian authors to be read? Do they want Indian articles to be read? We have been writing about the oil thing, the oil story, about how India is actually helping, and I've written about this. India is helping the world tame inflation. That story never got out. To beyond, I mean, they don't read. Beyond, I mean, they might read News 18, but they may not even pick it up. They don't want to circulate the information, even if it is written in the English language in India. Our voice will be, they will try to stifle it. Media platforms will try and do it. Twitter is trying to do it. You'll find more and more of this over time. So your battle of narratives is also about how much of the internet do you actually own and control? What kind of tech platforms do you have? And can you get others onto your tech platforms? And then you set the rules. Then you change the engagement. You see, that's how America dominates narratives, because they own the platforms and they own the universities that are supplying information. They own a lot of the media networks. And through this entire Anglosphere media network, they basically have been able to dominate. So this is something that, I mean, do we have to be takers of this information, or can we produce our own and create our own space? And this is something that we'll be able to see over the next 10 to 15 years.
Right. And also whether we can shut out Rihanna's of the world with
Yeah, exactly. That's true. That's true.
Right. Sagorika, we just got 2 more minutes. If you could just wrap it up for us.
Sure, I will just draw from something Surya has said, and it is nefarious. If you think that the narrative building is for India only, you're mistaken, because if you look at how the Americans do this before every regime change, before every war, before every internal destabilization, you will find a pattern. When the CIA was training Kosovo Liberation Army, there were very positive articles about the Kosovan Albanians, so the Kosovars, the Albanians in Kosovo, the Muslim population that was against the Croats as well as the Serbs, right? Suddenly, when the KLA went out of hand, the narrative changed. I mean, you were funding these terrorists. What did you expect? The same thing with the Taliban. You funneled money into the ISI, $10 billion, and you said, take care of the Taliban. Seriously? Of course, the money went to create the Taliban and fund them and get them to do better things. And now then, when you finally have to run away, okay, the Taliban, we think that the Taliban is a good leader of a country. It understands better. Their tribal leaders understand better than an imposed population. So you have reporters on CNN talking about, but at least the Talibanis are wearing masks. Who cares?
And they're like our country boys. They're like our
Yes,
country
yes,
boys.
yes,
That
yes.
was the term used by
Yes,
one of the
yes,
US
yes.
guys.
So this is something now you can only imagine the designs, and I have no problem sounding like a conspiracy theorist, unlike Surya, who maintains composure, because so far whoever has been called a conspiracy theorist in the West has been proven right in a matter of 3 years since the COVID-19 thing happened. Everything that was supposed to be a conspiracy has been proven to not be a conspiracy. So one can only imagine the designs they have for India if this is the narrative that they have in place. Everything is anti-India, everything is anti-Modi, everything is anti-BJP, everything is anti-Hindutva. So what do they expect when they think that they will execute a successful regime change operation in India, install somebody they see as pliant to Western requirements, and Western requirements change all the time. All they need is somebody to not make up their own minds. We tell you this, we want you to align with this, we need you to send money towards this cause, which is typically conversion, because then you have an entirely pliant state with loyalties separate from nationhood, right? So separate from sovereignty. So they expect that is when they will change the narrative, talk about how when India is becoming more sophisticated. And when you've always written about how poverty-stricken, how malnourished, how pathetically uneducated an entire country is, just a few pieces of information talking about the information bears, digital India, Prime Minister Modi and defense capabilities, India buying Russian oil. A few of those articles will not make any difference in the longer term. Their audience will buy into that whole poverty porn version of things again when they think that they've executed that regime change operation, and you'll go back to thinking, हाँ इंडिया तो ऐसा ही था, पता नहीं क्या बोल रहे थे इसके बारे में लोग. अब भारतवासी जो बाहर बैठे ना वो भी ऐसे ही सोचेंगे हमने गलत सोच लिया था ना. That is the idea. I don't think it'll be successful, but I can't think that is not the design. That's the design, because you've seen this happen. You've seen this in Serbia, you've seen this in Afghanistan, you've seen this in Iraq, you've seen this across every war that the US has waged. This is the narrative that precedes action.
Right.
Just a quick point. I just wanted to add one thing. The narratives that are there about the Indians abroad is because, or rather Hindus in general and conservative Indians, or quote unquote what the West likes to call as conservative Indians, it's because the Indian diaspora has been extremely successful and has actually taken a lot of jobs, top-end jobs, that some of the people would have liked to see their own ethnic groups hold. And this is something which is starting to feed into this idea that has been floated that Indians are white adjacent, and they use this as a cudgel against the Indian community, and it manifests itself, for example, in this caste bill in the US, because they want to say that the Indian is the oppressor in some way, just primarily because of their success. And they need to weaponize a narrative against people. They did this with, for example, the Jews in Europe, because they were wealthy, they were successful, and they became a target over time. I'm not saying that that's the same, that will necessarily be the case with Indians, but I'm trying to say that the idea of making people feel ashamed for being successful is cornerstone to the current narratives that you see.
Right. I think what we can say is कि सावधान रहिए, सतर्क रहिए, and use your own brain, and don't get riled up by information from anywhere. Just match it with your day-to-day reality and the facts, even if it's someone trying to gaslight you as a media house within India or outside, and have that balance, which I think Surya said, life is a balance, right? Dharma, that right and wrong, and you get that sense of balance. So It was a pleasure having you, Surya. It was a pleasure having you, Sagorika, and we hope to see you guys more often now on issues of geopolitical significance, on issues of civilization, and current day-to-day affairs. Thank you so much. Please do like,
Thank you.
share, subscribe our channel, and we'll keep on getting you such fabulous guests from time to time. Thank you. Thanks both of you. Thank you.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
Great. Thank you. Bye-bye.